They were born into a world holding its breath. The 1960s were not gentle years. They were loud, divided, unfinished, a decade that never quite exhaled. Televisions glowed in dark living rooms, not with entertainment, but with history unfolding in real time. Black and white images of war zones, marches, police lines, and crowds that looked angry and hopeful at the same time. Voices rose, leaders fell. The ground beneath the country shifted again and again, and no one pretended it wasn't happening. Children growing up in the 1960s learned something very early. The world was not predictable, and because of that, neither were people. Looking back, we didn't even have the language for it. Nobody sat us down and explained uncertainty or instability or psychological stress, but we felt it. You could feel it in the air, in the way adults spoke in lowered voices, in the way dinner conversations suddenly went quiet when the news came on, in the way neighbors argued on sidewalks about things that felt far bigger than any one person. The world didn't feel safe, but it felt real, and we weren't shielded from it. There were no filters, no content warnings, no gentle explanations designed to preserve innocence. We saw what was happening because it was happening everywhere. The Vietnam War wasn't a distant concept. It was on the television every night. Civil rights weren't abstract ideals. They were playing out in the streets. Assassinations weren't historical events. They were breaking news. And we were just kids. Yet somehow we understood the weight of it, not intellectually, but emotionally. We sensed that things could change fast, that nothing was guaranteed, that adults didn't always have control. It was unsettling, but we didn't stop to analyze it. We adapted. We had to. There was no option to pause childhood and process the world. Life kept moving. School still happened. Streets still filled with bikes and scraped knees, and kids learning how to navigate reality without supervision. And quietly, without anyone naming it, a certain psychology began to form. This generation didn't grow up protected from reality. They absorbed it. They heard adults whisper about nuclear threats and the end of days. They listened to conversations about war casualties and political unrest while tying their shoes or pouring cereal. They watched leaders fall and institutions fracture, and they learned something that stayed with them for life. Stability is temporary. My dad used to talk about the end of days, not obsessively, not dramatically, just casually, like it was a possibility you kept in the back of your mind. And I remember walking down the street as a kid, hearing neighbors argue about Vietnam or Kennedy, or whether the country was coming apart. No one told us to leave the room. No one said, "You're too young for this." We were part of it. And that's what made this generation different. They didn't grow up inside a bubble. They grew up inside tension. They learned early that adults disagreed, that systems failed, that the world could feel dangerous and still require you to get up the next morning and go to school. They didn't have the luxury of ignorance. They had awareness, and awareness changes you. People who grew up in the 1960s developed a psychology shaped by instability, but not fragility. They learned how to adapt without ever being taught the word for it. There were fewer rules about emotions and even fewer conversations about feelings. Nobody asked how you were processing things. You were expected to keep going. Pain was something you carried, not something you displayed. If something hurt, you dealt with it. If you were scared, you learned to function anyway. There was an unspoken expectation that life would not slow down just because you were uncomfortable. This wasn't cruelty, it was reality. Unlike those who grew up in the 1970s, during a period of reflection and rebuilding, the 1960s child was shaped during the storm itself, not its aftermath. They didn't inherit lessons neatly packaged as wisdom. They survived experiences and let those experiences harden into instinct. As kids, they roamed freely. No tracking, no constant supervision. They learned boundaries by crossing them. learned consequences by falling, failing, and getting back up without an audience. There were no phones recording their mistakes, no comment sections judging their every move. That kind of freedom creates something rare: inner authority. People from this generation don't wait for validation. They trust their judgment because they had to rely on it early. They learn to make decisions without constant feedback, without reassurance, without applause. When they speak, it's often long after silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because they don't waste words. Emotionally, they are complex. They may not express vulnerability openly, but their loyalty runs deep. When they commit fully. When they show up, they stay. Especially when things fall apart, because they remember when things really did fall apart. They don't romanticize struggle, but they respect it. They don't chase comfort the way later generations do. Comfort was never guaranteed. Safety was never assumed. Life taught them early that you don't build your identity around ease. You build it around endurance. And this is where their strength truly stands apart. People raised in the 1960s know how to remain steady while the world changes. They've already seen institutions collapse, cultures shift, and truths get rewritten. They've seen movements rise and fade. They've lived through contradictions. Change doesn't scare them. They've lived inside it. Their resilience isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself online. It doesn't demand recognition. It shows up quietly, in responsibility, in patience, in consistency, in the ability to endure without being seen. They are often misunderstood as distant, reserved, sometimes even cold. But beneath that surface is a generation that learned to survive emotionally before emotional survival had a name. They carry history not just in memory, but in their nervous systems. They know what uncertainty feels like in the body. They learned early that the world can shake, and you still have to stand. The psychology of the 1960s generation isn't about nostalgia. It's not about longing for the past or claiming superiority. It's about strength shaped by uncertainty, strength formed without instruction manuals or therapy language. They are not harder because they wanted to be. They are harder because they had to be. And that difference still lives inside them today. In a world that constantly reacts, they remain grounded. In a culture obsessed with expression, they value restraint. In a time of endless noise, they understand silence. If you're from the 1960s, you carry something rare, a kind of steadiness that doesn't come from optimism, but from experience. You've already seen the world fracture and reform. You know that chaos doesn't mean collapse. It just means change. And you're still here, still standing, still steady, still carrying the quiet strength of a generation shaped by history itself. If you're from the 1960s, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know you're still here. In a world that keeps shifting, it matters. If this made you think differently, hit subscribe. We go deeper every day.